September 1944, Western Europe. Imagine standing at the edge of victory, so close you can taste it. Imagine being the most feared general in the Allied armies, your tanks racing across France like a wildfire, enemy soldiers fleeing before you've even arrived. Imagine knowing, absolutely knowing, that the war could end in weeks if you just keep moving forward. And then imagine being forced to stop, not by enemy fire, not by brilliant enemy tactics, not by some desperate last stand that breaks your advance like waves against rocks, but by gasoline. This is the story of one of World War II's greatest what-ifs, a moment so pivotal that German commanders themselves, years after their defeat, would describe it in almost supernatural terms. They called it the miracle in the West, not because their troops fought with superhuman courage, not because their defenses held against impossible odds, but because their enemies simply stopped. At the precise moment when Nazi Germany stood naked and defenseless in Western Europe, when the road to Berlin lay open like an invitation written in blood, General George S. Patton's Third Army, the most aggressive, fast-moving, successful American force in the European theater, ground to a halt. The date was early September 1944. The place was eastern France, roughly 100 miles from the German border. And what happened next would extend World War II by 6 months, cost tens of thousands of additional lives, and give Germany time to launch one final, desperate counteroffensive that would shock the world, the Battle of the Bulge. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. It didn't have to happen this way. German commanders knew it, American officers knew it, and when the war ended and historians began piecing together what actually occurred during those critical September days, the truth emerged like a ghost from the archives. Germany was finished in the West, utterly, completely finished, and then they weren't. This is the story of the pause that changed everything, the moment when logistics defeated momentum, when supply lines mattered more than courage, when the tyranny of distance and fuel trucks determined the fate of nations. This is the story of the day Patton stopped and Germany survived. The black Mercedes rolled through the gates of OB West headquarters on September 5, 1944, carrying a 68-year-old Prussian aristocrat who had every reason to believe his military career, possibly his life, was over. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was not a Nazi. He was something both more dangerous and more useful to Hitler's regime. A professional soldier of the old school, a man whose family had served German states for centuries, whose loyalty was to duty rather than ideology. He wore his Iron Cross from the First World War, alongside the newer decorations from Poland, France, and Russia. His face carried the aristocratic severity of a man who had commanded armies when Hitler was still an unknown corporal ranting in Munich beer halls. 2 months earlier, Rundstedt had committed an unforgivable sin in Nazi Germany. He had told the truth. In July, as Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead and began their devastating sweep across France, Rundstedt had been summoned to a telephone conversation with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff. Keitel had asked what should be done about the deteriorating situation. Rundstedt's answer was 3 words: "Make peace, you fools." Within hours, he was relieved of command. The Führer did not tolerate defeatism, even from field marshals, especially from field marshals. In Hitler's increasingly detached worldview, defeats happened because commanders lacked will, lacked faith, lacked the fanatical determination that could supposedly bend reality itself. Rundstedt returned to his estate, expecting either retirement or a visit from the Gestapo. Instead, he received a summons. Hitler wanted him back. When a totalitarian regime fires you for honesty and then desperately recalls you, it means one thing: the truth you spoke has arrived, wearing boots and carrying rifles, and now they need someone who actually understands it. The headquarters building was familiar. Rundstedt had commanded from here before his dismissal, but everything else had changed. The confident efficiency of June had evaporated. Staff officers moved with the barely controlled panic of men watching a dam crack. Telephone lines buzzed with reports that sounded less like military communications and more like distress signals from a sinking ship. General Gunther Blumentritt was waiting. As Chief of Staff for the Western Front, Blumentritt had the unenviable task of translating catastrophe into coherent briefings. He was a skilled staff officer, methodical and intelligent, and right now, he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. The maps told the story before anyone spoke a word. 6 weeks. That's all it had been since the Americans broke out at Avranches. 6 weeks since Patton's Third Army had erupted from the Normandy bocage, like a predator escaping a cage. And in those 6 weeks, the map of occupied Europe had been redrawn in broad American strokes. Cities that had been secure German positions in July were now behind enemy lines. Paris, liberated on August 25th to delirious crowds and tears of joy. Nancy, Reims, Verdun, Metz, names that carried the weight of World War I history, now threatened or already captured. The Gothic line in Italy, the Atlantic Wall, the carefully prepared defensive positions, all rendered meaningless by the sheer speed of the American advance. But it was the southern sector that commanded attention. The sector labeled Third Army on the situation map. Blumentritt's finger traced the American axis of advance. It looked less like a military movement and more like a sprint. In 3 weeks, Patton had covered over 400 miles. His armored spearheads were now approximately 100 miles from the Rhine River, Germany's last natural barrier in the west, the river that had protected Germanic tribes from Roman legions 2,000 years ago. Between those American tank columns and the German homeland, Blumentritt explained in a voice stripped of military euphemism, there was nothing substantial, no intact divisions, no prepared defenses, no reserves positioned to launch a counterattack. Nothing. Runstedt studied the map with the cold assessment of a career soldier who had fought in 2 world wars. He had commanded panzer armies during the invasion of France in 1940, watching with satisfaction as German mobility shredded French defensive plans. He had commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union, learning the hard lesson that space itself could be a weapon when an enemy refused to collapse. Now he was seeing those lessons applied against Germany. The irony was not lost on him. What forces do we have to stop him? Runstedt asked. The question was rhetorical. He could read the map symbols well enough, but he needed to hear it stated plainly. Blumentritt's answer was brutally concise. Nothing. Not insufficient forces. Not below-strength divisions. Not the typical staff officer's careful language that softens reality into something more palatable. Nothing. To understand how completely Germany's position had disintegrated, you need to grasp what nothing actually meant in military terms in September 1944. The Wehrmacht in the West had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. This wasn't merely a retreat. Armies retreat all the time, falling back to prepared positions, maintaining unit cohesion, trading space for time while preserving combat power. What happened to German forces after the Normandy breakout was something far more catastrophic: organizational collapse. Consider the arithmetic. In June 1944, Germany had fielded approximately 60 divisions in France and the Low Countries. These weren't all elite formations, but they were organized, equipped units with command structures, supply lines, and the capacity to fight as cohesive military organizations. By early September, the German High Command estimated that the effective combat strength of the entire Western Front equaled roughly 10 to 12 divisions. But even that number disguises the reality. A German infantry division, on paper, numbered about 17,000 men, organized into 3 regiments with supporting artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance battalions. The divisions, limping eastward in September 1944, were often glorified battalions, 2,000 to 5,000 exhausted survivors, missing their heavy equipment, their command vehicles, their radios, their artillery pieces. A military unit without communications is not really a unit. It's a crowd wearing the same uniform. The roads told the story more honestly than any situation report. German officers who survived the retreat described scenes that haunted them for years afterward. Highways jammed with vehicles stretching for miles. Horse-drawn carts. Yes, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses, overturned in ditches, their contents scattered. Trucks abandoned when fuel ran out, their drivers joining the columns of soldiers trudging eastward on foot. Weapons discarded. Rifles, machine guns, even personal sidearms thrown aside. Because when panic sets in, anything that weighs you down becomes unbearable. Ammunition crates broken open, contents left in piles by the roadside. Field kitchens, radio trucks, staff cars, everything that makes an army more than just armed men, lying wrecked or burning. And overhead, constantly, the Allied fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. Its fighters were grounded by fuel shortages, its pilots dead or defending German cities from British and American bomber streams. This meant Allied tactical aircraft owned the skies. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs prowled French roads like predators, their pilots hunting anything that moved. German soldiers learned to move only at night or in bad weather. Daylight movement was suicide. Columns that tried to move during the day were torn apart from the air. 50 caliber machine gun fire raking trucks, bombs cratering roads, rockets turning tanks into funeral pyres. The psychological effect was devastating. An army that cannot move in daylight has already conceded a fundamental reality. The enemy controls the battlefield. But here's what made the situation uniquely desperate. The Siegfried Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable western fortifications, was a hollow shell. After Germany's stunning victory over France in 1940, the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall, had been stripped. Its garrison troops were sent to Russia. Its weapons were pulled out for use on the Eastern Front. Its ammunition stocks were depleted. The concrete bunkers remained, yes, built in the 1930s, with interlocking fields of fire, anti-tank obstacles, and underground command posts. The infrastructure was still there. But infrastructure without soldiers is just architecture. In September 1944, German engineers frantically worked to make the West Wall operational again. But they needed time. Time to bring up ammunition, time to install weapons, time to train crews who had never operated pillbox defenses, time to lay fresh minefields and repair anti-tank ditches that had been filling with dirt and vegetation for 4 years. Time was the one commodity Germany didn't have. Against this vacuum, consider what Patton commanded. Third Army, one of the most formidable military forces ever assembled. 12 divisions, most near full strength. Armored divisions with hundreds of Sherman tanks, supported by tank destroyers, armored infantry, and self-propelled artillery. Infantry divisions with modern communications, motorized transport, and integrated air support. And most critically, momentum. Patton's troops had been advancing so rapidly that they had internalized victory. They expected to win. They expected the enemy to run. Morale was sky high. Casualties had been relatively light during the pursuit, and every soldier in Third Army could feel that they were part of something historic, the final destruction of Nazi Germany's military power in the West. The Germans knew this. Their intelligence services, even in chaos, remained professional. They tracked Third Army's movements. They intercepted American radio traffic. They interrogated prisoners, and everything they learned confirmed their worst fears. Patton wasn't being cautious. He wasn't pausing to consolidate. He was driving his forces forward with an aggression that bordered on recklessness, convinced that speed itself was a weapon, that maintaining pressure would prevent the Germans from ever stabilizing a defense. He was right. General Siegfried Westphal, the operations officer at OB West headquarters, would later testify to American interrogators that on September 1, 1944, Germany had nothing capable of stopping Third Army. The Americans could have driven to the Rhine, possibly across it, and there was no German force that could have prevented it. Field Marshal Keitel, speaking from the perspective of Hitler's high command, was even more blunt. When asked post-war whether Germany could have stopped Patton if Third Army had continued its advance, Keitel stated flatly, "No, we had no reserves. The West Wall was not manned. Patton would have reached the Rhine by mid-September." These weren't just defeated generals making excuses. These were professional military men whose post-war testimony was cross-referenced and verified against captured German documents, unit records, and Allied intelligence reports. The evidence from all sources pointed to the same conclusion. In early September 1944, Germany was defenseless in the West. And then, impossibly, Patton stopped. Or more accurately, Patton was stopped, not by German resistance, but by mathematics. The arithmetic of modern warfare is cruel and precise. An armored division at full combat power consumes approximately 30,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Third Army fielded 4 armored divisions and 8 infantry divisions, plus supporting units. Total fuel consumption, somewhere north of 400,000 gallons per day. Every gallon had to travel from ports in Normandy. The Allies had expected to capture major port facilities quickly, Antwerp, Brest, Le Havre. But German garrisons held out with fanatical determination, denying the Allies the deep water ports needed for efficient logistics. This meant everything. Fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, medical supplies had to be trucked hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches through a logistics network that was being stretched thinner with each mile Patton advanced. The Allied supply system, named the Red Ball Express, was a marvel of improvisation. Thousands of trucks, driven round the clock by supply troops, many of them African-American soldiers in segregated units, whose contribution to victory deserves far more recognition than it has received, hauled supplies eastward in constant shuttles. But there's a perverse logic to logistics. The faster you advance, the longer your supply lines become, and the more fuel you consume simply moving supplies forward. Eventually, you reach a point where trucks are burning more fuel delivering fuel than they're actually delivering. Third Army hit that point in early September. For the tank crews and infantry of Patton's divisions, the experience was surreal and infuriating. They had been living in motion, engines roaring, tracks clanking, dust clouds rising, villages liberated every few hours, prisoners taken by the thousands, the sensation of unstoppable forward momentum. And then, silence. Orders came down to halt, to consolidate positions, to conserve fuel for essential operations only. Sherman tanks that had been racing across France sat immobile by roadsides. Infantry who had been riding in trucks now walked patrols. Artillery that could have been pounding German positions sat quiet, ammunition rationed. The men could see it on their maps. Empty space ahead, broken enemy forces, the Rhine River tantalizingly close. And they were stuck. Not pinned down by enemy fire, not held up by fierce resistance, simply stuck. Captain Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer in 3rd Army's 3rd Armored Division, later wrote in his memoirs about the frustration of those days. His maintenance crews could repair battle damage, replace worn-out parts, even rebuild transmissions in field conditions. But they couldn't conjure gasoline from thin air. He described watching tank crews perform busy work, cleaning already clean machine guns, checking and rechecking equipment, anything to avoid thinking about the fact that they were immobile while victory waited just beyond the horizon. Some crews painted kill markings on their tanks, others wrote letters home, though mail service was as disrupted as fuel supply. A few played cards or read paperback novels from home, but mostly they sat and stared eastward, toward Germany, wondering what was happening to the enemy they'd been chasing. What was happening was a miracle. At least, that's how German commanders described it. In Rundstedt's headquarters, the first indications came through signals intelligence. German radio operators, monitoring American communication networks, began picking up unusual patterns. References to fuel shortages, units reporting that they were immobilized pending resupply, operations canceled or postponed. At first, the German staff suspected deception. Patton had a well-earned reputation for misdirection. His infamous Ghost Army, the fictional 1st U.S. Army group that the Allies had used to deceive the Germans before D-Day, had demonstrated how effective false intelligence could be. Perhaps, German planners theorized, the Americans wanted them to think 3rd Army was immobilized, while secretly preparing a massive thrust from an unexpected direction. Days passed. The American spearheads remained stationary. More days passed. 3rd Army engaged in local actions, minor adjustments to the front line, but no major offensive operations. Gradually, incredulously, German intelligence analysts reached an impossible conclusion. The Americans had actually stopped themselves. Blumentritt would later describe the atmosphere in OB West headquarters when this realization sank in. Officers stood around situation maps in stunned silence. Some literally couldn't believe it. After weeks of watching red arrows advance inexorably across their maps, watching their defensive lines collapse, watching entire armies disintegrate, suddenly the red arrows had frozen in place. It was, Blumentritt said in post-war, testimony, as if we had been drowning, and suddenly the water level stopped rising. We could not understand it. From a military standpoint, it made no sense. Rundstedt, with his decades of command experience, grasped the situation more quickly. He had planned campaigns himself. He understood logistics. The Americans had outrun their supply lines. The pursuit had moved so fast that the administrative tail couldn't keep up. But understanding why the Americans had stopped didn't make it any less providential from the German perspective. For several days, the German high command hardly dared to react, fearing the pause was temporary, that at any moment 3rd Army would surge forward again and complete Germany's destruction. But as days became a week, and a week became 2 weeks, the reprieve felt increasingly real. And Germany did what Germany always did well. They organized. The transformation of Germany's western defenses between early September and late November 1944 was one of the most remarkable military recoveries of World War II. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't post-war myth-making. Allied intelligence watched it happen in real time and grew increasingly alarmed. The first priority was manning the Siegfried Line. Units that had been retreating in disorder were collected at rally points, reorganized into provisional formations, and marched into the empty bunkers. Officers shouted at retreating soldiers, sometimes at gunpoint, forcing them to turn around and occupy defensive positions. Training battalions, units that had been preparing for combat in the safety of German training grounds, were rushed westward before their instruction was complete. 18-year-old recruits who expected months of preparation found themselves in frontline bunkers within days. Luftwaffe ground crews, suddenly unnecessary as the Luftwaffe's fighter strength evaporated, were formed into improvised infantry battalions. These were not elite troops. They were mechanics and armorers, and administrative personnel who had never expected to fight as riflemen. But they could man a bunker, they could operate a machine gun, and they could make an American assault costly. Naval personnel from bases in Norway and Denmark were stripped from their posts and sent to the Western Front. Submariners who had survived the Battle of the Atlantic found themselves in muddy foxholes in the Hurtgen forest. Even concentration camp guards were reassigned. The SS, always eager to demonstrate their supposed combat prowess, contributed some divisions, though these varied wildly in quality, from elite panzer formations to hastily assembled police battalions. By late September, the Siegfried Line had gone from a hollow shell to a genuine defensive system. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough. Enough meant that American and British forces, when they finally resumed offensive operations, encountered real resistance. Bunkers with actual garrisons, artillery positions that were occupied and supplied with ammunition, minefields that had been properly laid, anti-tank obstacles covered by fire. The second priority was rebuilding armored strength. German tank production remained substantial in late 1944, one of the war economy's surprising successes. Factories in the Ruhr, operating underground or dispersed to avoid Allied bombing, continued producing Panther and Tiger tanks at impressive rates. The problem had never been production, it was organization. Panzer divisions shattered in Normandy had lost their tanks, yes, but more critically, they had lost their experienced crews, their maintenance specialists, their command structures. You can build a tank in a factory, but you can't mass produce a veteran tank commander. The September pause gave Germany time to rebuild these formations properly. Surviving crews from decimated units were combined. New tanks rolled off production lines and were distributed. Training programs, rushed but functional, prepared replacement crews. Mechanics and maintenance personnel were concentrated in refitting centers. By November, several panzer divisions that had been annihilated in France were back at combat effective strength. The 2nd Panzer Division, nearly destroyed during the Normandy fighting, was rebuilt and transferred west. The Panzer Lehr Division, gutted by Allied fighter bombers, was reconstituted. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, one of the most experienced formations in the Wehrmacht, was pulled from the Eastern Front and refitted. These were not invincible super units. German fuel shortages limited training. Replacement crews lacked the experience of 1940-era veterans. Equipment quality was declining as Germany's industrial base crumbled under Allied bombing. But they were organized, coherent military formations with tanks, artillery, and the command structure needed to conduct offensive operations. Allied intelligence watched this buildup with growing concern. Ultra-intelligence, the Allies' ability to read German encrypted communications, provided strategic warning, but couldn't reveal everything. The Germans, learning from bitter experience, increasingly relied on landline communications and courier-delivered orders for sensitive operations, reducing their radio signature. By mid-November, Allied estimates suggested Germany had rebuilt to approximately 30 division equivalents in the West. Not all were high-quality formations, but they represented a genuine defensive capacity across key sectors. More ominously, intelligence analysts began detecting patterns that suggested something beyond defense. large-scale ammunition stockpiling in the Ardennes region, fuel depots being established behind quiet sectors of the front, armored formations concentrating in areas where there was no immediate threat. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., along a quiet sector of the American front line in Belgium and Luxembourg, German artillery suddenly opened fire with a concentration not seen in the West since Normandy. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. 3 German armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, and 7th Army, totaling approximately 250,000 men and 1,400 tanks and assault guns, crashed into thinly held American positions. The Americans, convinced Germany was finished, had positioned inexperienced divisions and exhausted units in this quiet sector to rest and refit. The German onslaught achieved complete surprise. Within days, German spearheads had penetrated 50 miles into American lines, creating a massive bulge in the front that gave the battle its name. American units were surrounded. Entire battalions surrendered or were destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division, in combat for only days, lost 2 entire regiments. For a week, it looked like Germany might achieve the impossible, a repeat of 1940, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace. But Germany in late 1944 was not Germany in 1940. The attackers were running on fumes, literally. Panzer divisions captured American fuel depots because their own supplies were exhausted. When American resistance stiffened and those fuel dumps stayed out of reach, German tanks ran dry and were abandoned. The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied air power to enter the battle. Waves of fighter bombers shredded German columns. Strategic bombers struck supply lines. The Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to contest the skies resulted in catastrophic losses of irreplaceable pilots. By January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. German forces were pushed back to their starting positions, having accomplished nothing except casualties. American casualties, approximately 89,000, including 19,000 killed, the largest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. German casualties, approximately 100,000, plus irreplaceable losses in tanks, artillery, and most critically, experienced soldiers and officers. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, was asked after the war whether the Ardennes attack could have been launched if Patton had continued his advance in September. His answer was unequivocal: impossible. The troops, the fuel, the ammunition used in the Ardennes offensive would have been consumed trying to stop 3rd Army from reaching the Rhine. There would have been no reserves, no stockpiled supplies, no capacity for offensive action. The pause in September gave us the breathing room to attempt something audacious. Without it, we would have been purely defensive from September until the end. But the Ardennes wasn't the only cost of the September pause. When 3rd Army finally received adequate supplies and resumed offensive operations in mid-September, the war had fundamentally changed. The easy war, the war of pursuit and liberation, of French villagers throwing flowers, of rapid advances and light casualties, was over. Now came the grinding war, the war of the Hurtgen Forest, where American divisions disappeared into dark woods and emerged as shattered remnants. The war of Metz, where medieval fortresses had been modernized into killing zones. The war of the West Wall bunkers, where every pillbox had to be reduced with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties climbed horrifically. Divisions that had fought across France with relatively light losses now bled white, attacking prepared fortifications. The weather turned. Rain, then sleet, then snow. Foxholes filled with water. Soldiers developed trench foot, the same disease that had crippled armies in World War I. The ground became mud, limiting mobility and making every movement exhausting. Patton's diary entries from this period reflect bitter frustration. On September 17th, he wrote, "We have at this time the greatest chance to win the war ever presented. If they will give me the supplies, I will go through the Siegfried Line like shit through a goose." But by the time adequate supplies arrived, the Siegfried Line was no longer a hollow shell. It was occupied, fortified, and dangerous. 3rd Army wouldn't cross the Rhine until March 22nd, 1945, more than 6 months after Patton's forces had first come within striking distance. By then, Germany was collapsing under pressure from both east and west. Soviet armies were approaching Berlin. The Reich's industrial capacity was gutted by Allied bombing. The war's end was inevitable. But 6 months is not an abstraction. 6 months is winter. 6 months is the Bulge. 6 months is tens of thousands of casualties that might have been avoided. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the United States Army established the Foreign Military Studies Program. Its mission? Conduct comprehensive interviews with German commanders to understand how Germany had fought the war. These weren't war crimes tribunals. They were historical research projects conducted by professional military historians and intelligence officers. The goal was educational. Extract lessons that might be useful in future conflicts. Thousands of pages of testimony were collected. German generals asked to explain their decisions, their capabilities, their assessment of Allied operations, spoke with remarkable candor. They had lost. There was no reason to lie anymore. The question of Patton's September halt appeared repeatedly in these interrogations because American officers desperately wanted to know, could it have been different? Field Marshal von Rundstedt, testifying in 1946, stated, "The halt of Third Army in early September was incomprehensible from our perspective. Patton had broken through. Our forces were in retreat, with no capacity to establish a coherent defense. That he did not reach the Rhine when we were at our weakest was a gift we had not earned." General Blumentritt was more detailed. On September 7th, I personally drove to forward positions to assess our defensive capabilities. What I found was chaos. Units that existed on paper were scattered remnants. The Siegfried Line bunkers were empty or held by handfuls of men with insufficient ammunition. When I returned to headquarters, I told Rundstedt truthfully that if the Americans continued, we could not stop them. The Rhine would be crossed within 2 weeks. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at Hitler's headquarters, provided perhaps the most damning testimony. "We had no reserves. The West Wall was not properly manned. If Patton had maintained his advance, he would have reached the Rhine by mid-September at the latest. What prevented this was not German resistance, but American supply difficulties." General Siegfried Westphal, operations officer for OB West. "The September pause was the turning point. It gave us time, perhaps 3 weeks, to organize something resembling a coherent defense. In those 3 weeks, we brought in divisions from quieter sectors. We manned the fortifications. We positioned artillery. We created at least a thin screen that could delay the enemy. Without that time, there would have been nothing. These were not defeated men making excuses for their failures. These were professional soldiers, many from aristocratic Prussian military families, whose code of honor valued honesty about military facts. They had every incentive to portray German defensive operations as skillful and determined. Instead, they testified that they had been helpless, saved not by their own brilliance, but by the enemy's logistical constraints. The testimony converged on a single conclusion. In early September 1944, Germany was defenseless in the West, and American forces could have crossed the Rhine, possibly ending the war in Europe months earlier, if the advance had continued. Wars are not decided by single moments. They are the accumulated weight of thousands of decisions, each interacting with countless variables, producing outcomes that can never be perfectly predicted. But some moments carry more weight than others. September 1944 was one of those moments. If Patton had reached the Rhine in September, would the war have ended by Christmas? We cannot know with certainty. Hitler might have continued fighting regardless. German forces on the Eastern Front might have retreated into the Reich and prolonged the struggle. The atomic bomb might still have been years away from completion, and the Pacific War would have continued. But what we do know, because German commanders told us, is that Germany's ability to resist in the West was shattered in September, and the pause gave them time to rebuild. Time means lives. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign, fought from September to December 1944, cost approximately 33,000 American casualties in one of the war's most brutal battles. The Battle of the Bulge, 89,000 American casualties, over 100,000 German. The final campaigns across Germany, tens of thousands more on both sides, plus civilian casualties as the war raged through German cities and towns. And there's another cost, harder to quantify. The Holocaust continued. In September 1944, Auschwitz was still operating. Jews from Hungary, from Poland, from across occupied Europe were still being murdered in gas chambers. Every week the war continued was another week of genocide. By the time Allied forces finally overran the concentration camps in spring 1945, 6 million Jews were dead, along with millions of other victims: Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, resistance fighters. Could an earlier end to the war have saved some of them? The question torments historians because the answer is possibly. This is the crushing weight of the September pause. Not merely a tactical decision, not merely a supply problem, but a moment when history pivoted on logistics, and the price was measured in human lives. Patton knew. In his diary and in conversations with staff officers, he repeatedly expressed his belief that the war could have been won in 1944 if he'd been given the supplies to continue. Whether he was entirely right is debatable. Generals always believe in their own plans, but the Germans themselves agreed with him. The lesson is not that logistics don't matter. They matter supremely. Modern armies are impossibly complex machines that consume thousands of tons of supplies daily. You cannot will fuel into existence. The lesson is that sometimes, in war, there are moments when the impossible becomes possible. When the enemy is broken and the path is open. When speed and aggression matter more than careful planning. September 1944 was one of those moments, and it slipped away. Not in a dramatic battle, not in a heroic last stand, but in the quiet arithmetic of fuel trucks and supply depots, in the unsexy mathematics of logistics that determine what armies can and cannot do. The trucks didn't arrive in time. Patton stopped. Germany survived, and the war ground on through winter, costing tens of thousands more lives, until finally, in spring 1945, the end came. But it didn't have to take that long. If you found this story as haunting as I do, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the moments that changed World War II, the decisions that shaped history, the battles that could have gone differently, the human stories behind the statistics. Drop a comment. Do you think the war could have ended in 1944 if Patton had continued? What would you have done with Third Army in September? And check out our video on the Battle of the Bulge to see what Germany did with the time they'd been given, their final, desperate gamble that shocked the world. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it happened the way it did. And sometimes, it's about realizing how close things came to being completely different. Thanks for watching.